Obesity isn't new, but the obesity epidemic is. We went from a few corpulent kings and queens like Henry VIII or Louis VI, known as Louis le Gros or Louis the Fat, to a pandemic of obesity now considered to perhaps be the most dire and poorly contained public health threat of our time. About 37% of American men are obese, and 41% of American women, with no end in sight. Earlier reports had suggested at least the rise in obesity was slowing down, but even that doesn't appear to be the case. Similarly, we thought we were turning the corner finally on childhood obesity after 35 years of unrelenting bad news, but the bad news continues. Childhood and adolescent obesity rates have continued to rise now into the fourth decade. Over the last century, obesity appears to have jumped tenfold, from about 1 in 30 to now 1 in 3, but it wasn't a steady rise. Something seems to have happened around the late 1970s, and not just here, but around the globe. The obesity pandemic took off at about the same time across the world in most high-income countries in the 1970s and 1980s. The fact that the rapid rise appeared almost concurrently across the industrialized world suggests a common cause. What might the trigger have been? Any potential driver would have to be global in nature and coincide with the upswing of the epidemic. So the change would have had to start about 40 years ago, and able to spread rapidly around the globe. Let's see how the various theories stack up. For example, some have blamed changes in our built environment, shifts in city planning that have made communities less conducive to walking, biking, grocery shopping. But that doesn't meet our criteria for a credible cause, because there wasn't a universal, simultaneous change in our neighborhoods within that time frame. If you do a survey of hundreds of policymakers, most blame the obesity epidemic on lack of personal motivation. But do you see how little sense that makes? Here in the US, for example, obesity shot up across the entire population in the late 1970s. Are you telling me that every single sector of the entire population suffered some sort of simultaneous decline in willpower? Every age, sex, and ethnic group, with all their different attitudes and experiences, coincidentally lost their collective capacity for self-control at the same time? More plausible than a global change in the nature of our characters would be some global change in the nature of our lives. The food industry blames inactivity. If all consumers exercise, said the CEO of PepsiCo, obesity wouldn't exist. Coca-Cola went a step further, spending $1.5 million to create the Global Energy Balance Network to downplay the role of diet. Leaked emails show the company planned on using the front to serve as a weapon to change the conversation about obesity in its war with the public health community. The tactic is so common among food and beverage companies, it even has a name: lean washing. You've heard of greenwashing, where companies deceptively pretend to be environmentally friendly. Well, lean washing is the term used to describe companies that try to position themselves as helping to solve the obesity crisis when they're instead directly contributing to it. Indeed, the largest food company in the world, for example, Nestle, has rebranded itself as the world's leading nutrition, health, and wellness company. Yes, that Nestle, makers of Cookie Crisp and historically more than 100 different brands of candy, including Butterfinger, Kit Kat, Goobers, Gobstoppers, Runts, and Nerds. Another of their slogans is "Good Food, Good Life." Their Raisinets may have some fruit, but they seem to me more Willy Wonka than wellness. Let's just say that on their "What is Nestle doing about obesity" webpage, their "Read about our Nestle Healthy Kids program" link gives you a "page not found" error. The constant corporate drumbeat of overemphasis on physical inactivity appears to be working. In response to a Harris poll question, which of these do you think are the major reasons why obesity has increased, a large majority chose lack of exercise, while only 34% chose excess calorie consumption. That's actually been identified as one of the most common misconceptions about obesity. The scientific community has come to a fairly decisive conclusion that the factors governing calorie intake more powerfully affect overall calorie balance. It's more our fast food than our slow motion. There's even considerable debate in the scientific literature as to whether changes in physical activity have had any role whatsoever in the obesity epidemic. The increase in caloric intake per person is more than enough to explain the obesity epidemic in the United States, and around the rest of the world as well. In fact, if anything, the level of physical activity over the last few decades has actually slightly gone up in both Europe and North America. Ironically, this may actually be as a result of the extra energy it takes to move around our heavier bodies, making it a consequence of the obesity problem rather than the cause. Formal exercise is only a small part of our total daily activity, though. Think about how much more physical work people used to do in the workplace or on the farm, right? Or even in the home. It's not just the shift in color from blue to white. Increasing automation, computerization, mechanization, motorization, and urbanization have all contributed to increasingly more sedentary lifestyles over the last century. But that's the problem with the theory. The occupational shifts and advent of labor-saving devices has been gradual and largely predated the dramatic recent rise in weight gain the world over. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and the Model T were all invented before 1910. Indeed, when put to the test using state-of-the-art methods to measure energy in and energy out, it was caloric intake, not physical activity, that predicted weight gain over time. The common misconception that obesity is mostly due to the lack of exercise may not just be a benign fallacy. Personal theories of causation appear to impact people's weight. Those who blame insufficient exercise and are significantly more likely to be overweight, put them in a room with chocolate and they can be covertly observed consuming more candy. Those holding that view may be different in other ways, though. You can't prove cause and effect until you put it to the test. And indeed, people randomized to read an article implicating inactivity went on to eat significantly more sweets than those reading about research that indicted diet. A similar study evidently found that those presented with research blaming genetics subsequently ate significantly more cookies. The paper was entitled "An Unintended Way in Which the Fat Gene May Make You Fat." To date, about 100 genetic markers have been linked to obesity, but put them all together, and overall, they account for less than 3% of the difference in BMI between people. The fat gene you may have heard about, called FTO, short for fat mass and obesity associated, is the gene most strongly linked to obesity, but it explains less than 1% of the difference between people, a mere 0.34%. FTO codes for a brain protein that appears to affect your appetite. Are you one of the billion people that carry the FTO susceptibility genes? Who cares, as it only appears to result in a difference in intake of a few hundred extra calories a year. The energy imbalance that led to the obesity epidemic is on the order of hundreds of calories a day, and that's the gene so far known to have the most effect. The chances of accurately predicting obesity risk based on FTO status is only slightly better than flipping a coin. In other words, no, those genes don't make you look fat. When it comes to obesity, the power of your genes is nothing compared to the power of your fork. Even the small influence the FTO gene does have appears to be weaker among those who are physically active, and maybe abolished completely in those eating healthier diets. FTO only appears to affect those eating diets higher in saturated fat, predominantly found in meat, dairy, and junk food. Those eating healthier appear to be at no greater risk of weight gain, even if they inherited the fat gene from both their parents. Physiologically, FTO gene status does not appear to affect your ability to lose weight. Psychologically, though, knowing that you're at increased genetic risk for obesity may motivate some people to eat and live healthier, but may cause others to fatalistically throw their hands up in the air and resign themselves to thinking that it just runs in their family. Obesity does tend to run in families, but so do lousy diets. Comparing the weight of biological versus adopted children can help kind of tease out the contributions of lifestyles versus genetics. Children growing up with two overweight biological parents were found to be 27% more likely to be overweight themselves, whereas adopted children placed in a home with two overweight parents were 21% more likely to be overweight. So, genetics does play a role, but this suggests it's more the children's environment than their DNA. One of the most dramatic examples of the power of diet over DNA comes from the Pima Indians. The Pima Indians of Arizona have among the highest rates of obesity and the highest rates of diabetes in the world. This has been ascribed to their relatively fuel-efficient genetic makeup. Their propensity to store calories may have served them well in times of scarcity, when they were living off of corn, beans, and squash, but when the area became settled, their source of water, the Gila River, was diverted upstream. Those who survived the ensuing famine had to abandon their traditional diet to live off of government food programs, and chronic disease rates skyrocketed. Same genes, but different diet, different result. In fact, a natural experiment was set up. The Pima living over the border in Mexico come from the same genetic pool, but were able to maintain more of their traditional lifestyle, sticking with their beans, tortillas, and potatoes. Same genes, but 7 times less obesity, about 4 times less diabetes. Genes may load the gun, but diet pulls the trigger. It's been said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. The known genetic contribution to obesity may be small, but in a certain sense you could argue it's all in our genes. The excess consumption of available calories may be hardwired into our DNA. We were born to eat. Throughout most of human history and beyond, we existed in survival mode in a context of unpredictable scarcity, so we've been programmed with a powerful drive to eat as much as we can, while we can, and just store the rest for later. Food availability could never be taken for granted, so those who ate more in the moment and were able to best store more fat for the future might better survive subsequent shortages to pass along their genes. So generation after generation, millennia after millennia, those with lesser appetites may have died out, and those who gorged may have selectively lived long enough to pass along their genetic predisposition to eat and store more calories. And this may be how we evolved into such voracious calorie-conserving machines. Now that we're no longer living in such lean times, though, we're no longer so lean. What I just described is the thrifty gene concept, proposed in 1962, the proposal that obesity is the result of a mismatch between the modern environment and the environment in which we evolved. It's like we're now polar bears in a jungle. All that fur and fat may have given them an edge up in the Arctic, but would be decidedly disadvantageous in the Congo. Similarly, a propensity to pack on the pounds may have been a plus in prehistoric times, but can turn into a liability when our scarcity-sculpted biology is plopped down into the land of plenty. So it's not, gluttony or sloth. Obesity may simply be a normal response to an abnormal environment. Much of our physiology is finely tuned to stay within a narrow range of upper and lower limits. Right? If we get too hot, we sweat. If we get too cold, we shiver. Right? Our body has mechanisms to keep us in balance. In contrast, our bodies have little reason to develop an upper limit to the accumulation of body fat. Right? In the beginning, there may have been evolutionary pressures to keep us lithe and nimble in the face of predation, but thanks to things like weapons and fire, we haven't had to outrun as many saber-toothed tigers for about 2 million years or so, and this may have just left our genes with a one-sided selection pressures to binge on every morsel in sight and stockpile as many calories onto our bodies as possible. What was once adaptive is now a problem, or at least so says the thrifty gene hypothesis that originated more than half a century ago. It provides a simple and elegant explanation for the modern obesity epidemic, and was quickly embraced by scientists and lay people alike, although Neil later distanced himself from the original proposal. Despite remaining mostly theoretical, the basic premise remains largely accepted by the scientific community, and the implications are profound. In 2013, the American Medical Association voted to classify obesity as a disease, against the advice of their own Council on Science and Public Health. Not that it necessarily matters what we call it. A rose by any other name would cause just as much diabetes. But disease implies dysfunction. Bariatric drugs and surgery are not correcting some, anomaly of human physiology. Our bodies are just doing what they were designed to do in the face of excess calories. Rather than some sort of disorder, weight gain is largely a normal response by normal people to an abnormal situation. More than 70% of Americans are now overweight, so it's literally normal. A body gaining weight when excess calories are available for consumption is behaving normally. Efforts to curtail such weight gain with drugs or surgery are not efforts to correct an anomaly in human physiology, but rather to deconstruct and reconstruct its normal operations at the core. The traditional medical view on obesity is summed up nearly a century ago. All obese persons are alike in one fundamental respect: they literally overeat. While this may be true in a technical sense, this is in reference to overeating calories, not food. Our primitive urge to overindulge is selective. People don't tend to lust for lettuce. We have a natural inborn preference for sweet, starchy, fatty foods, because that's where the calories are concentrated. Think about hunting and gathering efficiency. We used to have to work hard for our food. Prehistorically, it doesn't make sense to spend all day collecting types of food that, on average, don't provide at least a day's worth of calories. Right? You would have been better off staying back in the cave. Right? So we evolved to crave foods with the biggest caloric bang for their buck. If you were able to steadily forage a pound of food an hour, and it had 250 calories per pound, it might take you 10 hours just to break even on your calories for the day. But if you were gathering something with 500 calories a pound, you could be done in 5 hours and spend the next 5 practicing your wall paintings. So the greater the energy density, the more calories per pound, the more efficient the foraging. So we developed an acute ability to discriminate foods based on calorie density, and to instinctively desire the densest. If you study the fruit and vegetable consumption of 4-year-old children, their liking correlates with calorie density. They prefer bananas over berries, carrots over cucumbers. Well, duh, isn't that just a preference for sweetness? No. They also prefer potatoes over peaches, and green beans over melon, just like monkeys prefer avocados over bananas. We appear to have this inborn drive to maximize calories per mouthful. All the foods that researchers tested were naturally less than 500 calories per pound. Bananas topped the chart at about 400. Something funny happens when you start going over that. We lose our ability to differentiate. Over the natural range of calorie densities, we have this uncanny aptitude to pick out the subtle distinctions. However, once you start heading towards bacon, cheese, and chocolate territory, which can reach thousands of calories per pound, our perceptions become relatively numb to the differences. No wonder, since these foods were unknown to our prehistoric brains. It's like the dodo bird failing to evolve a fear response because they had no natural predators, and we all know how that turned out. Or sea turtle hatchlings crawling in the wrong direction towards artificial light rather than the moon. Aberrant behavior explained by an evolutionary mismatch. The food industry exploits our innate biological vulnerabilities by stripping crops down into almost pure calories: straight sugar, oil, which is pretty much pure fat, and white flour, which is mostly refined starch. First, they have to remove the fiber, because it effectively has 0 calories. Run brown rice through a mill to make white, and you lose about 2/3 of the fiber. turn whole wheat flour into white and lose 75%. Or you can run crops through animals to make meat, eggs, and dairy, and remove 100% of the fiber. Right? And what you're left with is CRAP, an acronym used by one of my favorite dietitians, Jeff Novick. Calorie-rich and processed foods. Calories are condensed in the same way plants are turned into addictive drugs like opiates and cocaine. Concentration, crystallization, distillation, and extraction. They even appear to activate the same reward pathways in the brain. Put people with food addiction in an MRI scanner, show them a picture of a chocolate milkshake, and the areas that light up in their brains are the same as when cocaine addicts are shown a video on crack smoking. Food addiction is a misnomer. People don't suffer out-of-control eating behaviors to food in general. Right? We don't tend to compulsively crave carrots. Right? Milkshakes are packed with sugar and fat, two of the signals to our brains of calorie density. When people are asked to rate different foods in terms of cravings and loss of control, most incriminated was a load of crap, highly processed foods like donuts, along with cheese and meat. Those least related to problematic eating behaviors, fruits and vegetables. Right? Calorie density may be the reason people don't get up in the middle of the night and binge on broccoli. Animals don't tend to get fat when they're eating the foods they were designed to eat. Now, there is a confirmed report of free-living primates becoming obese, but that was a troop of baboons who evidently stumbled across some dumpsters at a tourist lodge. The garbage-feeding animals weighed 50% more than their wild-feeding counterparts. Sadly, we can suffer the same mismatched fate and become obese eating garbage too. For millions of years, before we learned how to hunt, our biology evolved largely on leaves, roots, fruits, and nuts. Maybe it would help if we went back to our roots and cut out the crap. The rise in the number of calories provided by the U.S. food supply since the 1970s is more than sufficient to explain the entire obesity epidemic. Similar spikes in calorie surplus were noted in developed countries around the world in parallel with, and presumed primarily responsible for, the expanding waistlines in their populations. By the year 2000, the United States was producing, after exports taken into account, 3,900 calories for every man, woman, and child, nearly twice as much as many people need. It wasn't always this way. The number of calories in the food supply actually declined over the first half of the 20th century, only starting its upward climb to unprecedented heights in the 1970s. The drop in the first half of the century was attributed to the reduction in hard manual labor. The population had decreased energy needs, so they ate decreased energy diets. They didn't need all the extra calories. But then the so-called energy balance flipping point occurred, when the move less, stay lean phase that existed through most of the century turned into the eat more, gain weight phase that plagues us to this day. So, what changed? What happened in the 1970s was a revolution in the food industry. In the 1960s, most food was prepared and cooked in the home. The average quote-unquote not working wife spent hours a day cooking and cleaning up after meals. The husband averaged 9 minutes. But then a mixed blessing transformation took place. Technological advances in food preservation and packaging enabled manufacturers to mass prepare and distribute food for ready consumption. The metamorphosis has been compared to what happened a century before in the Industrial Revolution with the mass production and supply of manufactured goods. This time they were just mass-producing food, using new preservatives, artificial flavors, and techniques such as deep freezing and vacuum packaging. Food corporations could take advantage of economies of scale to mass-produce ready-made, durable, palatable edibles that offered an enormous commercial advantage over fresh and perishable foods. Think ye of the Twinkie. Look, with enough time and effort, any ambitious cook could create a cream-filled cake, but now they're available around every corner for less than $1, or even delivered straight to your door for 30 cents. Right? If every time someone wanted a Twinkie, they had to bake it themselves, they'd probably eat a lot less Twinkies. The packaged food sector is now a trillion-dollar industry. Or consider the humble potato. We've long been a nation of potato eaters, but they were largely baked or boiled. Right? Anyone who's made fries from scratch knows what a pain it is, right? With all the peeling, cutting, and splattering. Right? But with sophisticated machinations of mechanization, French fry production became centralized and could be shipped at negative 40 degrees to any fast food deep fat fryer or frozen food section in the country to become America's favorite vegetable. Right? Nearly all the increase in potato consumption in recent decades has been in the form of French fries and potato chips. Cigarette production offers a compelling parallel. Up until automated rolling machines were invented, cigarettes had to be rolled by hand. It took 50 workers to produce the same number of cigarettes a machine could make in a minute. The price plunged, and production leapt into the billions. Cigarette smoking went from relatively uncommon to almost everywhere. In the 20th century, the average per capita cigarette consumption rose from 54 a year to 4,345 cigarettes a year by the time the 1964 Surgeon General's report. The average American went from smoking about one cigarette a week to a half pack a day. And tobacco itself was just as addictive before and after mass marketing. What changed was cheap, easy access. Right? French fries have always been tasty, but they went from being rare, even in restaurants, to omnipresent access around each and every corner, likely next to the gas station where you can get your Twinkies and cigarettes. But look, the first Twinkie dates back to 1930. Though, and Ore-Ida started selling frozen French fries in the 1950s. There has to be more to the story than just technological innovation, which we'll explore next. The rise in calorie surplus sufficient to explain the obesity epidemic was less a change in food quantity than in food quality, with an explosion in cheap, high-calorie, low-quality convenience foods. And the federal government very much played a role in making it happen. U.S. taxpayers give billions in subsidies to prop up the likes of the sugar industry, the corn industry and their high-fructose corn syrup, and soybean production, about half of which is processed into vegetable oil, and the other half used as cheap feed to help make dollar menu meat. Why do taxpayers give nearly $250 million a year to the sorghum industry? When's the last time you sat down to some sorghum? It's almost all fed to livestock. We created a pricing structure that favors the production of sugars, oil, and animal products. The Farm Bill started out as an emergency measure during the Great Depression in the 1930s to protect small farmers, but was weaponized by Big Ag into a cash cow with pork barrel politics, including said producers of cows and pork. From 1970 to 1994, global beef prices dropped more than 60%. If it weren't for taxpayers sweetening the pot with billions of dollars a year, high-fructose corn syrup would cost the soda industry about 12% more. Right? And then, of course, we hand them more billions through the food stamp program to give sugary drinks to the poor. Why is chicken so cheap? After one of the farm bills, corn and soy were subsidized below the cost of production for cheap animal fodder, effectively handing the poultry and pork industry about $10 billion each. Right? That's not chicken feed, or rather, it is. Now, this is changing what we eat, thanks in part to subsidies. Dairy, meats, sweets, eggs, oils, and soda were all getting relatively cheaper compared to the overall consumer food price index as the obesity epidemic took off, whereas the relative cost of fresh fruits and vegetables doubled. This may help explain why, during about the same period, the percentage of Americans getting even 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day dropped from 42% to 26%. Right? Why not just subsidize produce instead? Because that's not where the money is. To understand what's shaping our foodscape today, it's important to understand the significance of differential profit. Whole foods, or minimally processed foods such as canned beans or tomato paste, right, are what's referred to in the food business as commodities. They have such a slim profit margin, sometimes they're even sold at or below cost, as loss leaders to attract customers in hopes they'll also buy the value-added products. Right? Some of the most profitable for producers and vendors alike are the ultra-processed, fatty, sugary, salty concoctions of artificially flavored, artificially colored, and artificially cheap ingredients, thanks to taxpayer subsidies. Different foods reap different returns. Measured in profit per square foot of supermarket selling space, confectionaries like candy bars consistently ranked among the most lucrative. The markups are the only healthy thing about them, though. Fried snacks like potato and corn chips are also highly profitable. PepsiCo's subsidiary, Frito-Lay, brags that while their products represent only about 1% of total supermarket sales, they may account for more than 10% of operating profits for supermarkets and 40% of profit growth. There's no surprise, then, that the entire system is geared towards garbage. The rise in the calorie supply wasn't just more food, but a different kind of food. There's this dumb dichotomy about the drivers of the obesity epidemic. Is it the sugar, or is it the fat? Right? They're both highly subsidized, and they both took off. Along with a significant rise in refined grain products that's difficult to quantify, the rise in obesity was accompanied by about a 20% increase in per capita pounds of added sugars, and about a 38% increase in added fats. More than half of all calories consumed by most adults in the United States were found to originate from these subsidized foods, and appear to be worse off for it. Those eating the most had significantly higher levels of chronic disease, risk factors including elevated cholesterol, inflammation, and body weight. In the 1970s, the U.S. government went from just subsidizing some of the worst foods to paying companies to make more of them. In the 1970s, the Farm Bills reversed long-standing policies aimed at limiting production to protect prices, and instead started giving payouts in proportion to output. Extra calories started pouring into the food supply. Then Jack Welch gave a speech. In 1981, the CEO of General Electric effectively launched the shareholder value movement, reorienting the primary goal of corporations towards maximizing short-term returns for investors. This places extraordinary pressures on food companies from Wall Street to post increasing profit growth every quarter to boost their share price. There was already a glut of calories on the market, and now they had to sell even more. This places food and beverage CEOs in an impossible bind. It's not like they're rubbing their sticky hands together at the thought of luring more Hansels and Gretels to their doom in their houses of candy. Food giants couldn't do the right thing if they wanted. They are beholden to investors. Right? If they stopped marketing to kids, or tried to sell healthier food, or anything that could jeopardize their quarterly profit growth, Wall Street would demand a change in management. Right? Healthy eating is bad for business. It's not some grand conspiracy. It's not even anyone's fault, really. It's just how the system works. Given the constant demands for corporate growth and rapid returns in an already oversaturated marketplace, the food industry needed to get people to eat more. Like the tobacco industry before them, they turned to the ad men. The food industry spends about $10 billion a year on advertising, and around another $20 billion on other forms of marketing, such as trade shows and incentives, consumer promotions, and supermarket slotting fees. Food and beverage companies purchase shelf space from supermarkets to prominently display their most profitable products. They pay supermarkets. The practice is also evidently known as cliffing, because companies are forced to bid against each other for eye-level shelf placement, with the loser being, pushed over the cliff. With slotting fees up to $20,000 per item, per retailer, per city, you can imagine what kind of products get the special treatment. Hint, it ain't broccoli. To get a sense of what kind of products merit prime shelf real estate, look no further than the checkout aisle. Merchandising the power categories on every lane is critical, reads a trade publication on the best practices for superior checkout merchandising. They were referring to candy bars and beverages. Right? Evidently, even a 1% power category boost in sales could earn a store an extra $15,000 a year. Right? It's not that they necessarily don't care about their customers' health. Right? Publicly traded companies, like most of the leading grocery store chains, are said to have a fiduciary duty to increase profits above other considerations. Tens of millions of dollars are spent annually advertising a single brand of candy bar. McDonald's alone may spend billions a year. The food industry now spends more money on advertising than any other sector of the economy. Reagan-era deregulation removed the limits placed on marketing food products on television to children. Now the average child may see more than 10,000 food ads a year, and that's on top of the marketing online, in print, at school, on their phones, at the movies, and everywhere in between. Right? And nearly all of it for products detrimental to their health. Besides the massive early exposure and ubiquity, food marketing has become highly sophisticated. With the help of child psychologists, companies learn how to best influence children to manipulate their parents. Packaging is designed to best attract a child's attention and then placed at their eye level in the store. You know those mirrored bubbles right, in the ceilings of supermarkets? They're not just for shoplifters. Closed-circuit cameras and GPS-like devices on shopping carts are used to strategize how best to guide shoppers towards their most profitable products. Behavioral psychology is widely applied to increase impulse buying. Eye movement tracking technologies are utilized. The unprecedented rise in the power, scope, and sophistication of food marketing started around 1980. That aligns well with the blast-off slope of the obesity epidemic. Some of the techniques, such as product placement, in-school advertising, and event sponsorship, skyrocketed from essentially zero to multi-billion-dollar industry since the 80s. This led one economist to conclude, quote, "The most compelling single interpretation of the admittedly incomplete data we have is that the large increase in obesity is due to marketing." Yes, innovations in manufacturing and political maneuvering led to a food supply bursting at the seams, with close to 4,000 calories a day for us all, but it's the advances in marketing manipulations that are used to try to peddle that surplus into our mouths. The opening words of the Institute of Medicine's report on the potential threat posed by food ads were, "Marketing works." Yeah, there's a large number of well-conducted randomized studies I could go through showing advertising exposure and other marketing methods can change your eating behavior and get you to eat more, but what do you need to know beyond the fact that the industry spends tens of billions of dollars a year on it, right? I mean, to get people to drink their brown sugar water, do you think Coca-Cola would spend a penny more than they thought they had to? It's like when my medical colleagues accept drug launches from pharmaceutical representatives and take offense that I would suggest it might affect their prescribing practices. Do they really think drug companies are just in the business of giving away free money for nothing? Right? They wouldn't do it if it didn't work. Right? To give you a sense of marketing's insidious nature, though, let me share an interesting piece of research published in the world's leading scientific journal. In-store music affects product choice. Documented an experiment in which either French accordion or German Bierkeller music was played on alternate days in the wine section of a grocery store. On the days the French music was playing in the background, people were 3 times more likely to buy French wine, and on German music days, shoppers were about 3 times likely more to buy German wine. Despite the dramatic effect, not just a few percent difference, but a complete threefold reversal, when approached afterwards, the vast majority of shoppers denied the music had any influence on their choice. We all like to think we make important life decisions, like what to eat, consciously and rationally. However, if that were the case, we wouldn't be in the midst of an obesity epidemic. Right? Most of our day-to-day behavior does not appear to be dictated by careful, considered deliberations. Rather, we tend to make more automatic, impulsive decisions triggered by unconscious cues and habitual patterns, especially when we're tired, stressed, and preoccupied. The unconscious part of our brain is thought to guide human behaviors as much as 95% of the time. This is the arena where marketing manipulations do their dirty work. The part of our brain that governs conscious awareness may only be able to process about 50 bits of information per second, which is roughly equivalent to like a short tweet. Right? Our entire cognitive capacity, on the other hand, is estimated to process in excess of 10 million bits per second. Right? Because we're only able to purposefully process a limited amount of information at a time, if we're distracted or otherwise unable to concentrate, our decisions can become even more impulsive. An elegant illustration of this cognitive overload effect was provided from an experiment involving fruit salad and chocolate cake. Before calls could be made at a touch of a button or the sound of your voice, the 7-digit span of phone numbers was based in part on the longest sequence most people can kind of recall on the fly. We only seem to be able to hold about 7 chunks of information, plus or minus 2, in our immediate short-term memory. OK, so here's the setup. Randomize people to memorize either a 7-digit number or a 2-digit number to be recalled in another room down the hall. On the way, offer them the choice of a fruit salad or a piece of chocolate cake. Memorizing a 2-digit number is easy and presumably takes up few cognitive resources. Under the 2-digit condition, most chose the fruit salad. Faced with the same decision, most of those trying to keep the 7 digits in their heads just went for the cake. This can play out in the real world by potentiating the effect of advertising. Have people watch a TV show with commercials for unhealthy snacks, and no surprise, they eat more unhealthy snacks compared to those exposed to non-food ads. Or maybe that is a surprise. I mean, we all like to think that we're in control and not so easily manipulatable. The kicker, though, is that we may even be more susceptible the less we pay attention. Randomize people to the same 2- or 7-digit memorization task during the show, and the snack attack effect was magnified among those who were more preoccupied. And look, how many of us have the TV on in the background or multitask during commercial breaks? This research suggests that it may make us even more impressionable to the subversion of our better judgment. There's an irony in all this. Right? Calls for restriction on marketing are often resisted by invoking the banner of freedom. Right? But what does that even mean in this context, when research shows how easily our free choices can be influenced without our conscious control? A senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation even went as far as to suggest that, given the dire health consequences of our unhealthy eating habits, insidious marketing manipulation should be considered in the same light as the invisible carcinogens and toxins in the air and water that can poison us without our awareness. Food and beverage companies frame body weight as a matter of personal choice. Right? Even when we're not distracted, the power of the eat more food environment may sometimes overcome our conscious controls over eating. One look around the room at a dietitian convention can tell you that even nutrition professionals are vulnerable to the aggressively marketed ubiquity of tasty, cheap, convenient calories. This suggests that there are aspects of our eating behaviors that defy personal insight by flying below the radar of conscious awareness. Right? Appetite physiologists call the result of these subconscious actions passive overconsumption. Remember that brain scan study where the thought of a milkshake lit up the same reward pathways in the brain as substance abuse? That was triggered just by a picture of a milkshake. Right? Dopamine gets released, cravings get activated, and we're motivated to eat. Intellectually, we know it's just an image, but our lizard brain just sees survival. Right? It's just a reflexive response over which we have little control, which is why marketers ensure that there are pictures of milkshakes and their equivalents everywhere. Maintaining a balance between calories in and calories out feels like a series of voluntary acts under conscious control, but it may be more akin to bodily functions such as blinking, breathing, coughing, swallowing, or sleeping. I mean, you can try to will yourself power over any of those, but by and large they just happen automatically, driven by ancient scripts. Not only are food ads ubiquitous, so is the food. The types of establishments selling food products expanded dramatically in the 1970s and 1980s. Now there's candy and snacks at checkout counters of gas stations, and drugstores and bookstores, and places that used to just sell clothes or hardware or home furnishings, building supplies. Right? The largest food retailer in the United States is Walmart. There's that jolt of dopamine and artificially stimulated feelings of hunger around every turn. Every day, we run the gauntlet. It's become socially acceptable to eat anywhere, in your car, on the street, or packed in a crowded bus. Right? We've become a snacking society. Vending machines are everywhere. Daily eating episodes seem to have gone up by about a quarter from the late 1970s, from about 4 to 5 occasions a day, potentially accounting for twice the calorie increase attributed to increasing portion sizes. Snacks and beverages alone could account for the bulk of the calorie surplus implicated in the obesity epidemic. And think of the children. Here we are trying to do the best for our kids, right? Role modeling, healthy habits, feeding them healthy foods, but then they venture out into a veritable tornado of junky food and manipulative messages. This commentary in the New England Journal of Medicine asked, why should our efforts to protect our children from life-threatening illness be undermined by massive marketing campaigns from the manufacturers of junk food? Pediatricians are now encouraged to have the French fry discussion with parents at the 12-month well-child visit, and not wait all the way until year 2. And even that may be too late. 2/3 of infants are being fed junk food by their first birthday. Dr. David Katz may have said it best in the Harvard Health Policy Review. Those who contend that parental or personal responsibility should carry the day despite these environmental temptations might consider the implications of generalizing the principle. Perhaps children should be encouraged, but not required to attend school, and tempted each morning by alternatives such as buses to the circus, zoo, or beach. The plague of tobacco deaths wasn't just due to the mass manufacture and marketing of cheap cigarettes. Tobacco companies actively sought to make their products even more craveable by spraying the sheets of tobacco with nicotine and additives like ammonia to provide a bigger nicotine kick. The food industry employs taste engineers to accomplish a similar goal: maximize the irresistibility of their products. Taste is the leading factor in food choice. Salt, sugar, and fat are used as the 3 points of the compass to produce super-stimulating hyperpalatability to tempt people into impulsive buys and compulsive consumption. Foods are intentionally designed to hook into our evolutionary triggers and breach whatever biological barriers help keep consumption within reasonable limits. Big food is big business. The processed food industry alone brings in more than $2 trillion a year. That affords them the economic might to manipulate more than just taste profiles, but public policy and scientific inquiry as well. The food, alcohol, and tobacco industries have all used similar unsavory tactics, blocking health regulations, co-opting professional organizations, creating front groups, and distorting the science. The common playbook shouldn't be surprising given the common corporate threads. At one time, for example, Philip Morris owned both Kraft and Miller Brewing. In a single year, the food industry has spent more than $50 million to hire hundreds of lobbyists to influence legislation, most of whom were revolvers, former federal employees in the revolving door between industry and their regulators, who could push corporate interests from the inside, only to be rewarded with cushy lobbying jobs after their public service. In the following year, the industry acquired a new weapon, a stick, to go along with all those carrots. On January 21, 2010, the Supreme Court's 5-4 Citizens United ruling permitted corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money on campaign ads to trash anyone who dared stand against them. No wonder our elected officials have so thoroughly shrunk from the fight, leaving us largely with a government of big food, by big food, for big food. Globally, a similar dynamic exists. Weak tea calls from the public health community for voluntary standards are met with not only vicious fights against meaningful change, but massive transnational trade and foreign investment deals that cement protections of food industry profits into the laws of the lands. The corrupting commercial influence extends to medical associations, reminiscent of the just what the doctor ordered cigarette ads of yesteryear. the American Academy of Family Physicians accepted millions from the Coca-Cola Company, in part explicitly to develop consumer education content on beverages and sweeteners. On the front line, fake grassroots AstroTurf groups are used to mask the corporate message. In the footsteps of Get Government Off Our Back, memorably acronymed GGOOB, a front group created by R.J. Reynolds to fight tobacco regulation, Americans Against Food Taxes may just as well be called Food Industry Against Food Taxes. The power of front group formation is enough to bind bitter corporate rivals, the Sugar Association and the Corn Refiners Association, linking arms with the National Confectioners Association to partner with Americans for food and beverage choice. Another tried-and-true tobacco tactic, research front groups, can be used to subvert the scientific process by shaping or suppressing science that deviates from the corporate agenda. Take the trans fat story. Food manufacturers have not only long denied that trans fat were associated with disease, but actively worked to limit inquiry and discredit research findings. At what cost? The global death toll from foods high in trans fat, saturated fat, salt, and sugar are at 14 million lost lives every year. The inability of countries around the world to turn the tide on obesity is not a failure of personal willpower, said the Director General of the World Health Organization. It's a failure of political will to take on the powerful food and soda industries. She entered her keynote address for the National Academy of Medicine entitled Obesity and Diabetes, the Slow-Motion Disaster, with these words: "The interests of the public must be prioritized over those of corporations." When it comes to uncovering the root causes of the obesity epidemic, there appears to be a sort of manufactured confusion. Major studies assert the causes are extremely complex, fiendishly hard to untangle. Having just reviewed the literature, it doesn't seem like much of a mystery to me. It's the food. Attempts at obfuscation, rolling out hosts of implausible explanations like sedentary lifestyles or lack of self-discipline, serve the needs of the manufacturers and marketers more than the public's health and the interest of truth. When asked about the role of restaurants in the obesity epidemic, the president of the National Restaurant Association replied, "Look, just because we have electricity doesn't mean you have to electrocute yourself." Yes, but they're effectively attaching electrodes to shock and awe the reward centers in our brain to undermine our self-control. It's hard to eat healthfully against the headwind of such strong evolutionary forces. No matter what our level of nutrition knowledge, in the face of pepperoni pizza, the ancestral heritage baked into our genes is screaming, eat it now. Anyone who doubts the power of basic biological drive should see how long they can go without blinking or breathing. Right? Any conscious decision to hold your breath is soon overcome by the compulsion to breathe. In medicine, shortness of breath is sometimes even referred to as air hunger. Right? The battle of the bulge is a battle against biology. Right? So obesity is not some moral failing. Right? It's not gluttony or sloth. It's a natural, normal response to the abnormal, unnatural ubiquity of calorie-dense, sugary, and fatty foods. The sea of excess calories we are now floating in, and some of us are drowning in, has been referred to as the toxic food environment. This helps direct focus away from the individual towards the societal forces at work, such as the fact that the average child is blasted with 10,000 food commercials a year. Or maybe I should say pseudo-food commercials, as 95% of the ads are for candy, fast food, liquid candy, and breakfast candy. Wait a second, though. If weight gain is just a natural reaction to the easy availability of mountains of cheap, yummy calories, then why isn't everyone fat? Right? Well, in a certain sense, most everyone is. It's been estimated that more than 90% of American adults are overfed, defined as having excess body fat sufficient to impair health. This can occur even in normal weight individuals, which is often due to excess abdominal fat. But even if you just look at the numbers on the scale, being overweight is the norm. Right? If you look at the bell curve, and stick in the latest data, more than 70% of us are overweight, with a little less than a third on one side, normal weight, and more than a third on the other side, so overweight that we're obese. But if the food really is to blame, why doesn't everyone get fat? That's like asking, if cigarettes are really to blame, why don't all smokers get lung cancer? There is a genetic predisposition, and other exposures can weigh in to tip the scales. Different people are born with different susceptibility to cancer, but that doesn't mean smoking doesn't play a critical role in exploding whatever inherent risk you have, and the same with obesity and our toxic food environment. Right? It's like the firearm analogy. Genes may load the gun, but diet pulls the trigger, and we can try to switch the safety back on with smoking cessation and a healthier diet. If you lock up 24 folks and feed them the exact same number of excess calories, they all gain weight, but some gain more than others. Overfeeding the same 1,000 calories a day, 6 days a week for 100 days, caused weight gains ranging from about 9 pounds to 29 pounds. Right? The same 84,000 extra calories caused different amounts of weight gain. Some people are just more genetically susceptible. The reason we suspect it's genetics is that the 24 people in the study were 12 sets of identical twins, and the variation in weight gain between each of them was about a third less. A similar study with weight loss from exercise found a similar result. So yes, genetics play a role, but that just means that some people have to work harder than others. Right? Ideally, inheriting a predisposition for extra weight gain shouldn't give reason for resignation, but rather motivation to put in the extra effort to unseal your fate. Advances in processing and packaging, combined with governmental policies and handouts that foster cheap input for the food industrial complex, led to a glut of ready-to-eat, ready-to-heat, and ready-to-drink, hyper-palatable, hyper-profitable products. To help assuage impatient investors, marketing became even more persuasive and pervasive. All these factors conspired to create unfettered access to copious, convenient, low-cost, high-calorie foods, often willfully engineered with chemical additives to make them hyper-stimulatingly sweet or savory, yet only weakly satiating. As we all sink deeper into a quicksand of calories, more and more mental energy is required to swim upstream against the constant bombardment of advertising and 24/7 panopticons of arm's-length tempting treats. There's so much food flooding the market now that much of it ends up in the trash. Food waste has progressively increased by about 50% since the 1970s, perhaps better in the landfills, though, than filling up our stomachs. Too many of these cheap, fattening foods prioritize shelf life over human life. But hey, dead people don't eat. Don't food companies have a vested interest in keeping their consumers healthy? Such naivete reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the system. A public company's primary responsibility is to reap returns for investors. Consider the fact that the tobacco industry produced products that kill 1 in 2 of their most loyal customers. It's not about customer satisfaction, but shareholder satisfaction. The customer always comes second. Just as weight gain may be a perfectly natural reaction to an obesogenic food environment, governments and businesses are just responding normally to the political and economic realities of our system. Can you think of a single major industry that would benefit from people eating healthier? Certainly not the agriculture, food product, grocery, restaurant, diet, or drug industries. Wrote Emeritus Professor Marion Nestle in Science editorial when she was chair of nutrition at NYU. All flourish when people eat more junk, and all employ armies of lobbyists to discourage governments from doing anything about it. If part of the problem is cheap, tasty convenience, is the solution hard to find food that's gross and expensive? Or might there be a way to get the best of all worlds? Easy, healthy, delicious, satisfying meals that help you lose weight? That's the central question of my latest book, How Not to Diet. Check it out for free at your local library. Approximately 90% of the world's calories are provided by less than 1% of the 250,000 known edible plants. The big three are wheat, corn, and rice, the reliance upon which may be unsustainable given the ongoing climate crisis. This has spurred new interest into underutilized crops like quinoa, which might do better with the drought and heat. Quinoa has only been introduced in the northern hemisphere recently, but humans have been eating quinoa for more than 7,000 years. Is there any truth to the superfood designation, or is it all just marketing hooey? Quinoa is a pseudo-grain, since the plant it comes from isn't a type of grass. Technically, it's a seed-like fruit. It does have a lot of protein, also lots of vitamins and minerals, but so do all whole grains. Yeah, it has more protein than other grains, but since when do we need more protein, right? Fiber is what we're sorely lacking, and its fiber content is relatively modest compared to barley or rye, pretty strong on folate and vitamin E, and leads the pack on magnesium, iron, and zinc, so nutritious, sure. But when I think superfood, I think some sort of special clinical benefit. So, broccoli is a superfood, strawberries are a superfood, garlic is a superfood. But what about quinoa? Consumer demand is up, thanks in part to perceived health benefits. In lab animals, it has all sorts of purported benefits, but there have been very few human studies. The first trial was a before and after study of quinoa granola bars that showed drops in triglycerides and cholesterol, but with no control group. You don't know how much that would have happened without the quinoa. This is the kind of study I wanted to see, a randomized controlled trial. And about a cup a day of cooked quinoa for 12 weeks led to a 36% drop in triglycerides. That's comparable to what one gets with triglyceride-lowering drugs or high-dose fish oil supplements. Which is better, regular quinoa or red quinoa? Well, red does have about twice the antioxidant power, leading the investigators to conclude that red quinoa might significantly contribute to the management and/or prevention of degenerative diseases associated with free radical damage, though it's never been put to the test. What about black quinoa? Both red and black appear equally antioxidant-rich, both beating out the more conventional white. The only caveat I can find is to inform your doctor before your next colonoscopy, else they might mistake it for parasites. Colonoscopy revealed numerous egg-like tan yellow ovoid objects of unclear cause, but it was just undigested quinoa. What could help explain severe coronary disease in someone considered to be at low cardiovascular disease risk with a healthy lifestyle? Young man ends up in the ER with a heart attack, ultimately found to have severe coronary artery disease, yet given his age, blood pressure, and cholesterol, his 10-year risk of a heart attack should only be 2%. But what he did have was a high lipoprotein A level, also known as Lp(a), markedly high at 80, which may help explain it. You can see the same thing with women, 27-year-old with a heart attack with a high Lp(a). What is this Lp(a), and what can we do about it? Lp(a) is an underestimated cardiovascular risk factor. It causes coronary artery disease, heart attack, strokes, peripheral artery disease, calcified aortic valve disease, and heart failure. And these can occur even in people without high cholesterol, because it is cholesterol. It's basically an LDL cholesterol molecule linked to another protein, which, like LDL, transferred cholesterol into the lining of arteries, contributing to the inflammation in atherosclerotic plaques. But it has yet to gain recognition by practicing physicians, and the main reason for the limited clinical use of Lp(a) is a traditional lack of effective and specific therapies to lower it. Lp(a) concentrations are approximately 90% genetically determined, so the conventional thinking has been that, look, you're just kind of born with higher or lower levels, and there's not much you can do about it. Even if that were the case, you still might want to know about it, since if it were high, then that would be all the more reason to make sure all your other risk factors that you do have more control over are absolutely as good as possible, maybe help you quit smoking and do everything you can to lower your LDL cholesterol as much as possible. Lp(a) levels in the blood can vary 1,000-fold between individuals, from less than 0.1 milligrams per deciliter to 100 or more. Here's the graph of odds of heart disease at different levels. Less than 20 is probably optimal, with greater than 30 to 50 considered elevated. Even when the more conservative threshold of greater than 50 is used, that describes like 10 to 30% of the global population, an estimated 1.4 billion people. So if we're like the 1 in 5 people with elevated levels, what can we do about it? The way we know that Lp(a) causes atherosclerosis is that we can put it to the ultimate test. There's something called apheresis, which is basically like a dialysis machine where they can take out your blood, wash out some of the Lp(a), and then give your blood back to you. And when you do that, you can reverse the progression of disease. Atherosclerosis continues to get worse in the control group, but better in the apheresis group. This is great for proving the role of Lp(a), but has limited clinical application given the cost, accessibility, and the time commitment required for biweekly sessions of 2 to 4 hours each. It causes a big drop in blood levels, but they quickly creep back up, so you have to keep going in. Costing more than $50,000 a year. There has to be a better way, and we'll explore the role diet can play next. Lipoprotein A, also known as Lp(a), is an independent genetic and causal factor for cardiovascular disease and heart attacks. At any level of LDL cholesterol, your risk of heart attacks and strokes is 2 to 3-fold higher when Lp(a) is elevated. With a high enough level, atherosclerosis continues to progress even if you get your LDL cholesterol way down, which may help explain why so many people continue to have heart attacks and strokes even under treatment for high cholesterol. So it's suggested that doctors test lipoprotein A levels in a patient who's suffered such an event if it can't otherwise be easily explained. What's the point of checking it, though, if there's not much we can do about it? Right? To date, no drug to reduce circulating Lp(a) levels has ever been approved for clinical use. Some researchers blame our lack of knowledge on the fact that Lp(a) is not found in typical lab animals like rats and mice. It's only found 2 places in nature: primates and hedgehogs. How strange is that? No wonder Lp(a) is an enigmatic protein that has mystified medical scientists ever since it was first discovered a half-century ago. But who needs mice when you have men? Right? The level in our bloodstream is primarily determined by genetics, and for the longest time, Lp(a) was not thought much influenced by things such as diet. Given its similarity to LDL, though, one might assume a healthy lifestyle would help. However, the evidence has been lacking, but maybe that's because they've not yet tried a plant-based diet. We've known for years that the trans fats found in meat and dairy are just as bad as the industrial-produced trans fat found in partially hydrogenated oil, junk food, when it came to raising LDL cholesterol. When it comes to lipoprotein A, the meat and dairy trans fat appears to be even worse. Just cutting out meat, putting people on a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet does not appear to help, but put people on a whole food plant-based diet packed with a dozen servings of fruits and vegetables a day, and within 4 weeks, lipoprotein A levels dropped 16%. Of course, in those 30 days, they also lost 15 pounds, but weight loss does not appear to affect Lp(a) levels, so you figure it must have been due to the diet. Now, if you're already eating a healthy plant-based diet and your Lp(a) levels are still too high, are there any particular foods that can help? Like for cholesterol, even if the average total cholesterol of those eating strictly plant-based may be right on target at less than 150, with an LDL right on target at under 70, there's a bell curve, with plus or minus 30 falling immediately on both sides. Right? Enter the portfolio diet. It's not just plant-based, but adds specific cholesterol-lowering foods if that's not enough. So like, nuts and beans, oatmeal and berries to drag cholesterol down even further. What about Lp(a)? Nuts have been put to the test. 2.5 ounces of almonds every day dropped levels, but only about 8%. Well, that's better than the other studies on nuts that found no effect at all. No effect at all, and no effect at all. Nuts. There is one plant, though, that appears to drop Lp(a) levels 20%, enough to take people exceeding the U.S. cutoff down to a more optimal level, and that plant is a fruit. Emblica officinalis, otherwise known as AMLA, Indian gooseberries, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study asking smokers before and after about their cough, their shortness of breath, loss of appetite, and feelings of impending doom, palpitations, sleep deprivation, irritability, heartburn, and tiredness, as well as objective measurements from their blood count, cholesterol, DNA damage to antioxidant status, lung function, and the AMLA extract they used showed a significant improvement compared to placebo in all the parameters tested with no reports of side effects. That's unbelievable. No, really, that's unbelievable. And indeed, it's completely not true. Yes, subjective complaints got better in the AMLA group, but they got better in the placebo group too, with arbitrary scoring systems and no statistical analysis whatsoever. And of the 24 objective measures, only half could be said to reach any kind of even before and after statistical significance, and only 3 were significant enough to account for the fact that if you measure 24 things, a few things might pop up positive, if only by chance. Anytime you see this kind of spin in the abstract, which is sometimes the only part of the study people read, you suspect some kind of conflict of interest. But there were no conflicts of interest declared. But that's bullshit, as the study was funded by the very company selling those AMLA supplements. But anyways, one of those 3 significant findings was the Lp(a), so it might be worth a try. I mean, in the context of a plant-based diet, which in addition to the weight loss can dramatically improve blood pressures, even as people cut down on their blood pressure medications, plus a 25-point drop in LDL bad cholesterol, plus a 30% drop in C-reactive protein, and significant reductions in other inflammatory markers for a systematic cardioprotective effect, all thanks to this single dietary approach. Strokes are one of the leading causes of death and disability in the world, the most common cause of seizures in the elderly, and the second most common cause of dementia, and a frequent cause of major depression. In short, stroke is a burdensome but preventable brain disorder. According to the Global Burden of Disease Study, the largest study of risk factors for human disease in history, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, more than 90% of the stroke burden is attributable to modifiable risk factors, though some are easier to modify than others. For example, about 10% of all healthy years of life lost due to stroke may be due to ambient air pollution. So yeah, I mean, technically that's a modifiable risk factor. You could just move out of the city to some place with cleaner air, but perhaps easier to just quit smoking, which accounts for 18% of the stroke death and disability, about as much as diets high in sodium. Diets high in salt are as bad as smoking when it comes to stroke burden, but not as bad as inadequate fruit and vegetable consumption. Yes, there's also other things like sedentary lifestyles, which is not as bad as not eating enough whole grains, but of the 89% of the stroke death and disability that's attributable to modifiable risk factors, fully half appears to be due just to not eating enough fruits and veggies. Fruit and vegetable consumption is associated with a lower risk of about a dozen different diseases, and stroke is way up there. Right? There appears to be a linear dose-response relationship, a straight-line relationship between more fruits and vegetables and lower stroke risk, suggesting that the risk of stroke decreases by 32% for every 200-gram increase in fruits. That's just like 1 apple a day, and 11% lower risk for each equivalent amount of vegetables. Particularly potent citrus fruits, apples and pears, and dark green leafy vegetables, one of which you can drink, the green leaves of green tea. Right? Drinking 3 cups of green tea a day is associated with an 18% lower stroke risk. But association doesn't necessarily mean causation. Have there ever been any vegetables put to the test in randomized controlled trials? Yes! Garlic is so potent you can stuff garlic powder into a capsule or compress it into a tablet, so you can put it head-to-head against a sugar pill, and garlic beat out placebo for the prevention of CIMT progression, meaning that the thickening of the major artery walls to the neck going up to the brain, a key predictor of stroke risk. continuing to worsen in the placebo group, but not the garlic group that had been taking just a quarter teaspoon of garlic powder a day. That would cost about, a penny a day, and just make your food yummier anyway. OK, but has there ever been an interventional trial that's actually followed people out to prove that a certain food reduced strokes? Yes, nuts. The PrettyMed study showed that an ounce a day of nuts, which is what I recommend in my daily dozen, cuts stroke risk nearly in half. But wait, PrettyMed? Wait a second, wasn't that the study that was retracted? The PrettyMed trial is one of the most influential randomized trials ever. Yet in 2018, it was retracted only to be later republished after making the necessary corrections. Due to irregularities in their randomization procedures, the original paper was withdrawn, but in their reanalysis, they found the same results. The same 46% fall in stroke risk in the added nuts group, dropping the 10-year risk of stroke from about 6% down to 3%. The good news is that stroke risk can be reduced substantially by an active lifestyle, cessation of smoking, and a healthy diet. All we have to do now is educate and convince people on the benefits that can be expected from healthy lifestyle and nutrition. The large majority of the available evidence is in favor of a protective association between fruit and vegetable consumption and the risk of stroke. The worst foods appear to be meat and soda. Eating like a burger for lunch and a pork chop for dinner, 2 breakfast sausage links, and a typical 20-ounce bottle of soda may increase stroke risk by 60%. Reviewers suggest the meat effect may be the saturated fat or cholesterol, the iron-mediated oxidized fat, or the salt, but it could also be the TMAO, the carnitine in meat, and the choline in dairy, seafood, and especially eggs is converted by our gut bacteria into trimethylamine, which is oxidized by our liver to TMAO, which may then contribute to heart attacks, stroke, and death. And indeed, in a 2019 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, following tens of thousands of Americans for a median of about 17 years, up to a maximum of 31 years, found that higher consumption of dietary cholesterol or eggs was significantly associated with higher risk of incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality in a dose-response manner, meaning those who ate more eggs or consumed more cholesterol in general appeared to live significantly shorter lives on average, and the more eggs, the worse it was. And this includes egg consumption and stroke. But that's not what a meta-analysis funded by the egg industry found. It turns out that such meta-analyses have evidently been flawed by major methodological drawbacks. So, to eat or not to eat, it would seem moderation of egg consumption is called for, along with other sources of dietary cholesterol, given the new study data, which had the advantage of a longer follow-up than the majority of the previous studies, and may therefore have provided more power to detect associations. Similarly, with meta-analyses of dairy, no apparent link emerged, but evidence of publication bias was found, meaning there appeared to be missing studies, potentially shelved by industry-funded researchers for not showing funder-friendly effects. Researchers studying the relationship between funding sources and conclusions in studies of sugary drinks and milk found that studies funded by the likes of Coca-Cola and the Dairy Council had over 7 times the likelihood of coming to funder-friendly conclusions than independent research, which is twice as bad as drug companies. Big Pharma only seems to be able to get away with a 3-fold bias. Of particular interest, not a single one of the interventional studies looking at soda or milk ended up with an unfavorable conclusion. The bottom line is that yes, dairy fat may be better than other animal fats, such as those found in meat, but something like whole grains would be better still, though swapping dairy out for refined grains or added sugar wouldn't be doing you many favors. When it comes to stroke risk, vegetable fat is better than dairy fat, meat fat is the worst, whole grains are better, and fish fat, added sugars, and refined grains are statistically about the same. In terms of dietary patterns and stroke, most of the studies on plant-based dietary patterns have found a protective effect against stroke, whereas those looking at westernized patterns, those based more on animal foods and added sugars and fats, found a detrimental effect of adherence to westernized patterns. African Americans are 5 times as likely to die from stroke in middle age, a black-white disparity largely driven by the fact that they're just having so many more strokes. In this population, a Southern-style diet characterized by a lot of fried foods and meat may be playing a role in increasing the risk of stroke, whereas adherence to more plant-based diets may reduce stroke risk. Yes, wrote the director of the Stroke Prevention and Atherosclerosis Research Center, learning to make vegetarian meals every other day is a tall order for most North Americans, but is feasible given tasty recipes and a positive attitude. When ranked in order of importance, among the interventions available to prevent stroke, the 3 most important are probably diet, smoking cessation, and blood pressure control. Most of us are doing pretty good on smoking these days. Less than half of us are exercising enough, but according to the American Heart Association, only 1 in 1,000 Americans are eating a healthy diet, and fewer than 1 in 10 are even eating a moderately healthy diet. Why does it matter? Because diet is an important part of stroke prevention. Reducing sodium intake, avoiding egg yolks, limiting the intake of meat, and increasing the intake of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and lentils. Like the sugar industry, the meat and egg industry spend hundreds of millions of dollars on propaganda, unfortunately with great success. I was excited to check out box number 1, and was then honored when I did. The strongest evidence for stroke protection is for increasing fruit and vegetable intake with more uncertainty regarding the role of whole grains, animal products, and dietary patterns such as vegetarian diets. One would expect they'd do great. Meta-analyses have found that vegetarian diets lower cholesterol and blood pressure, and enhance weight loss and blood sugar control, and vegan diets may work even better. So all the key biomarkers are going in the right direction, but you may be surprised to learn that there hadn't ever been any studies on the incidence of stroke in vegetarians and vegans until now. And if you think that's surprising, wait until you hear the results. The risks of heart disease and stroke in meat-eaters, fish-eaters, and vegetarians over 18 years of follow-up. Yes, less heart disease among vegetarians, by which they mean vegetarians and vegans combined. No surprise, been there, done that, but more stroke. An understandable knee-jerk reaction might be, wait a second, who did this study? But this is Epic Oxford, world-class researchers whose conflicts of interest may be more likely to read, I was a member of the Vegan Society. What about over-adjustment? If you crunch the numbers, over a 10-year period they found 15 strokes for every 1,000 meat-eaters, compared to only 9 strokes for every 1,000 vegetarians and vegans. Wait, so how can they say there was more strokes in the vegetarians? This was after adjusting for a variety of factors. For example, the vegetarians were less likely to smoke, so you want to cancel that out by adjusting for smoking, so that you can effectively compare the stroke risk of non-smoking vegetarians to non-smoking meat-eaters. Right? If you want to know how a vegetarian diet itself affects stroke rates, you want to cancel out these non-diet-related factors. Sometimes, though, you can over-adjust. The sugar industry does it all the time. This is how it works. Imagine you just got a grant from the soda industry to study the effects of soda on the childhood obesity epidemic. What could you possibly do after putting all the studies together to arrive at the conclusion that there was near zero effect of sugary beverage consumption on body weight? Well, since you know that drinking liquid candy can lead to excess calories that can lead to obesity, if you control for calories, if you control for a factor that's in the causal chain, effectively only comparing soda drinkers who take in the same number of calories as non-soda drinkers, right? Then you could undermine the soda-to-obesity effect. And that's exactly what they did. That introduces over-adjustment bias. Right? Instead of just controlling for some unrelated factor, you control for an intermediate variable on the cause and effect pathway between exposure and outcome. Right? Over-adjustment is how meat and dairy industry-funded researchers have been accused of obscuring the true association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. Right? We know that saturated fat increases cholesterol, which increases heart disease risk. Therefore, if you control for cholesterol, effectively only comparing saturated fat eaters with the same cholesterol levels as non-saturated fat eaters, you see how you can undermine the saturated fat to heart disease effect. Right? Now let's get back to this. Since vegetarian eating lowers blood pressure, and a lowered blood pressure leads to less stroke, controlling for blood pressure would be an over-adjustment, effectively only comparing vegetarians to meat eaters with the same low blood pressure. Right? That's not fair, right? Since that's one of the benefits of vegetarian eating, not some unrelated factor like smoking, and so it would undermine the afforded protection. So did they do that? No. They only adjusted for unrelated factors like education and socioeconomic class and smoking and exercise and alcohol, right? And that's what you want, right? You want to tease out the effects of a vegetarian diet on stroke risk, right? You want to try to equalize everything else to tease out the effects of just the dietary choice. And since, for example, meat eaters in the study were on average 10 years older than the vegetarians, you can totally see how, when you adjust for that, vegetarians could come out worse. Since stroke risk can increase exponentially with age, you can see how having 9 strokes among 1,000 vegetarians in their 40s could be worse than 15 strokes among 1,000 meat eaters in their 50s. The fact that vegetarians had greater stroke risk, despite their lower blood pressure, suggests there's something about meat-free diets that so increases stroke risk it's enough to cancel out the blood pressure benefits. But even if that's true, you still would want to eat that way. I mean, stroke is our 5th leading cause of death, whereas heart disease is number 1. So yes, in this study, there were this many more cases of stroke in vegetarians, but there were this many fewer cases of heart disease. But if there is something increasing stroke risk in vegetarians, it may be nice to know what it is. It helps us figuring out how to get the best of both worlds. This is the question we'll turn to next. The risks of heart disease and stroke in meat eaters versus vegetarians over 18 years of follow-up. Not surprisingly, vegetarian diets were associated with less heart disease, 10 fewer cases per 1,000 people per decade compared to meat eaters, but vegetarian diets were associated with 3 more cases of stroke. So, eating vegetarian appears to lower the risk of cardiovascular disease by 7 overall, but why the extra stroke risk? Could it just be reverse causation? For example, when studies have shown higher mortality among those who quit smoking compared to continuing smokers, we suspect reverse causality. When we see a link between quitting smoking and dying, instead of quitting smoking leading to people dying, more likely dying led people to quit smoking. Right? It's the same reason why non-drinkers can appear to have even more liver cirrhosis, because it was their failing liver that led them to stop drinking. Right? This is the so-called sick quitter effect, and you can see it when people quit meat, too. See how new vegetarians can appear to have more heart disease than non-vegetarians? Well, why would some older person all of a sudden start eating vegetarian? Maybe it's because they've just been diagnosed with heart disease. So that may be why there appears to be higher rates at first, the sick quitter effect. Right? To control for that, you can throw out the first 5 years of data to make sure the diet has a chance to start working. And indeed, when you do that, the true effect comes clear: significant drop in heart disease risk. So does that likely explain the apparent increased stroke risk? No, because they still found higher stroke risk even after the first 5 years. OK, then what's going on? Well, let's dive deeper into the data to look for clues. This is what you get when you break down the results by type of stroke and type of vegetarian versus vegan. There are 2 main types of strokes: ischemic strokes and hemorrhagic strokes. Now, most are ischemic strokes, or clotting strokes where an artery in the brain gets clogged off, as opposed to hemorrhagic strokes, or bleeding strokes where a blood vessel in the brain ruptures. In the United States, it's about 90-10. 9 out of 10 strokes are clotting, 1 out of 10 the bleeding type. And that's what the vegetarians appeared to have significantly more of. Now, the vegans didn't. In fact, statistically have significantly higher risk of any kind of stroke. But that's terrible news for vegans. Vegans have the same stroke risk as meat eaters? What's going on, right? What's so increasing their stroke risk that it's offsetting all their natural advantages? And the same could be asked of vegetarians. Even though this was the first study of vegetarian stroke incidence, there have been about a half dozen studies on stroke mortality, and the various meta-analyses have consistently found significantly lower heart disease risk, but the lower stroke mortality was not statistically significant. Now, with this new study, vegetarians can take comfort in the fact that at least they don't have a higher risk of dying from stroke, but that's terrible news for vegetarians. Well, what? Statistically, vegetarians have the same stroke death rate as meat eaters? What's going on, right? What's so increasing their stroke rate that it's offsetting all their natural advantages? Right? OK, let's run through a couple possibilities. If you look at the vitamin D levels of vegetarians and vegans, they do tend to run consistently lower than meat eaters, and lower vitamin D status is associated with increased risk of stroke. But who has higher levels of the sunshine vitamin? Those who are outside running around and exercising. Maybe that's why their stroke risk is better. What we need are randomized studies, and when you look at people who've been effectively randomized at birth to have lifelong lower vitamin D levels just genetically, you do not see a clear indicator of increased stroke risk. So the link between vitamin D and stroke is probably not cause and effect. And so in terms of an answer to our question, vitamin D doesn't seem to fit, right? We'll explore some other possibilities next. In my last video, we started to explore what might explain the higher stroke risk in vegetarians found in the EPIC Oxford study. Lower risk of heart disease and lower risk of cardiovascular disease overall, but higher risk of stroke. We looked into vitamin D levels as a potential mechanism, but that didn't seem to be the case. What about long-chain omega-3s, the fish fats like EPA and DHA found, not surprisingly, in markedly lower levels in vegetarians and vegans? About 30% lower in vegetarians and more like half as low in vegans. But according to the most extensive, systematic assessment of effects of omega-3 fats on cardiovascular health to date, there is no benefit for stroke, combining 28 randomized controlled trials. And in fact, there was evidence that taking fish oil didn't help with heart disease or overall mortality either. This may be because, on one hand, the omega-3s may be helping, but the mercury in fish may be making things worse. That's the constant challenge among public health professionals, balancing the benefits with the contaminant risks. For example, dietary exposure to PCBs may be associated with increased risk of stroke. In this study, for instance, neither fish nor intake of PCBs was related to stroke risk. However, at the same fish intake, dietary PCBs were associated with an increased risk of stroke, so the PCB pollutants may be masking the fish benefit. Thus, if we had a time machine and could go back before the Industrial Revolution and find fish in an unpolluted state, it might protect against stroke. But looking at the data, if fish really was protected, then we might expect that the pescatarians, those who eat fish but no other meat, to be down here or something, right? Since they would have the fish benefit without the meat risk, but no, they're stuck out here. Right? So it doesn't seem to be the omega-3s either. Let's take a closer look at what the vegetarians were actually eating. When it comes to plant-based diets for cardiovascular disease prevention, all plant foods are not created equal. There are basically two types of vegetarians, those that do it for their health, and those who do it for ethical reasons, right, for like global warming or animals, and they tend to eat different diets, right? So for example, health vegans tend to eat more fruit and less sweets. You don't tend to see those doing it for health chowing down on vegan donuts. Right? In the United States, the primary motivations for meat reduction are health and cost. Middle-class American families 4 times more likely to reduce meat for health reasons compared to environmental or animal welfare concerns. But in the UK, where the stroke study was done, the number one reason given for becoming vegetarian or vegan is ethics. We know plant-based diets that emphasize higher intakes of plant foods and lower intakes of animal foods are associated with a lower risk of incident cardiovascular diseases, a lower risk of dying from all causes put together, but that's only for healthy plant foods. Eating lots of Wonder Bread soda and apple pie isn't going to be doing you many favors. Right? For all types of plant-based diets, it's crucial that the choice of plant foods is given careful consideration. Right? We should be choosing whole grains over refined grains, whole fruits, avoiding trans fats and added sugars. Right? Could it be that the veggie Brits were just eating more chips? We'll find out next. Plant-based diets are associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, mortality, and dying from all causes put together. This study of a diverse sample of 12,000 Americans found that progressively increasing the intake of plant foods by reducing the intake of animal foods may be associated with benefits on cardiovascular health and mortality. But when it comes to plant-based diets for cardiovascular disease prevention, all plant foods are not created equal. Were the vegetarians in the British study that found the higher stroke risk just eating a lot of vegan junk food? Any diet devoid of certain animal food sources can be claimed to be a vegetarian or vegan diet, so it's important to see what they were actually eating. One of the first things I look at when I'm trying to see how serious a population is about healthy eating is look at something undeniably, uncontroversially bad: soda, liquid candy. Right? Anyone drinking straight sugar water obviously doesn't have health top of mind. In the big study of plant-based eaters in America, where people tend to cut down on meat for health reasons far more than ethics, flexitarians drink fewer sugary beverages than regular meat eaters, as do pescatarians, vegetarians, and vegans. In the UK study, though, where the increased stroke risk was found, where folks are more likely to go veg or vegan for ethical reasons, the pescatarians are drinking less soda, but the vegetarians and vegans are drinking more. Now, I'm not saying that's why they had more strokes. It just might give us an idea of how healthy the people were eating. In the UK study, the vegetarians and vegan men and women were eating about the same amount of desserts, cookies, and chocolate, and about the same total sugar. In the US study, the average non-vegetarian is nearly obese. Even the vegetarians are a little overweight, and the vegans were the only ideal weight group. In this analysis of the UK study, though, everyone was about the same weight. In fact, the meat eaters were skinnier than the vegans. Right? The Epic Oxford study seems to have attracted a particularly health-conscious group of meat eaters, weighing substantially less than the general population. Let's look at some particular stroke-related nutrients. Dietary fiber appears beneficial for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, including stroke, and it appears the more, the better. Based on studies of nearly 500,000 men and women, there doesn't seem to be any upper threshold of benefit. So the more, the better. More than 25 grams of soluble fiber, 47 grams of insoluble dietary fiber, and you can really start seeing a significant drop in associated stroke risk. So one could consider these as the minimal recommendable daily intakes to prevent stroke at a population level. That's what you see in people eating diets centered around minimally processed plant foods. Dean Ornish got up around there with his whole food plant-based diet. Maybe not as much as we were designed to eat based on the analysis of fossilized feces, but that's the kind of neighborhood where we might expect significantly lower stroke risk. How much were the UK vegetarians getting? 22.1. Now, in the UK, they measured fiber a little differently, so that may actually be closer to 30 grams, but not the optimal level for stroke prevention. So little fiber that the vegetarians and vegans only beat out the meat eaters by about 1 or 2 bowel movements a week, suggesting they were eating lots of processed foods. The vegetarians were only eating about a half serving more fruits and vegetables, thought to reduce stroke risk in part because of their potassium content. Yet the UK vegetarians at higher stroke risk were evidently eating so few greens and beans they couldn't even match the meat eaters, not even reaching the recommended minimum daily potassium intake of 4,700 milligrams a day. And what about sodium? The vast majority of the available evidence indicates that elevated salt intake is associated with higher stroke risk. There's like a straight-line increase in the risk of dying from stroke the more salt you eat. Even just lowering sodium intake by a tiny fraction every year could prevent tens of thousands of fatal strokes. Reducing sodium intake to prevent stroke. Time for action, not hesitation. But the UK vegetarians and vegans appeared to be hesitating, as did the other dietary groups. All groups exceeded the advised less than 2,400 milligrams of daily sodium intake, and that doesn't even account for salt added at the table. And the American Heart Association recommends under just 1,500 a day. So they were all eating lots of processed food. So, no wonder the vegetarian blood pressures were only 1 or 2 points lower. And high blood pressure is perhaps the single most important modifiable risk factor for stroke. What evidence do I have that if the vegetarians and vegans ate better, their stroke risk would go down? Well, in rural Africa, where they were able to nail the fiber intake that our bodies were designed to get by eating so many whole healthy plant foods, fruits, vegetables, grains, greens, and beans, their protein almost entirely from plant sources, not only was heart disease, our #1 killer, almost non-existent, so apparently was stroke, surging up from out of nowhere with the introduction of salt and refined foods to their diet. Stroke also appears to be virtually absent in Catawba, a quasi-vegan island culture near Australia, where diet was very low in salt and very rich in potassium, because it was a vegetable-based diet. They ate fish a few times a week, but the other 95% or so of their diet was lots of vegetables, fruits, corn, and beans, and they had an apparent absence of stroke, even despite their ridiculous rates of smoking. After all, we evolved eating as little as less than 1/8 of a teaspoon a day of salt, and our daily potassium consumption is thought to have been as high as 10,000 milligrams. We went from an unsalted, whole food diet to salty processed foods depleted of potassium, whether we eat meat or not. Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic tried putting about 200 patients with established cardiovascular disease on a whole food plant-based diet. Of the 177 that stuck with the diet, only one went on to have a stroke in the subsequent few years, compared to a 100-fold greater rate of adverse events, including multiple strokes and deaths, in those that strayed from the diet. This is not vegetarianism. Esselstyn explains vegetarians can eat a lot of less than ideal foods. This new paradigm is exclusively whole food, plant-based nutrition. Now, this entire train of thought, that the reason typical vegetarians don't have better stroke statistics is because they're not eating particularly stellar diets, may explain why they don't have significantly lower stroke rates, but that still doesn't explain why they might have higher stroke rates. Even if they're just eating similarly crappy, salty, processed diets, at least they're not eating meat, which we know increases stroke risk. So there must be something about vegetarian diet that so increases stroke risk that it offsets their inherent advantages. We'll continue our hunt next. As Japan westernized, their stroke rate plummeted. Stroke was the leading cause of death in Japan, but the mortality rate sharply decreased as they moved away from their traditional diets and started eating more like those in the West. So maybe there was a protective effect of all the extra meat and dairy they started to eat. After all, their animal fat and animal protein intake were going up. At the same time, their stroke rates were going down. Protection from stroke by eating animal foods? Surely not, commented a noted Loma Linda cardiology professor. Many vegetarians, like myself, have almost come to expect the data to indicate that they have an advantage, whatever the disease that's being considered. Thus, it is disquieting to find evidence in a quite different direction for at least one subtype of stroke. Can dietary saturated fat like that found in meat and dairy be beneficial in the prevention of stroke risk? There appeared to be a protective association, but only in East Asian populations. High dietary saturated fat was found associated with a lower risk of stroke in Japanese, but not in non-Japanese. So what was it about the traditional Japanese diet where the westernization of their diets made things better when it came to stroke risk? Well, at the same time their meat and dairy was going up, their salt intake was going down. The traditional Japanese diet was packed with salt. In fact, they had some of the highest salt intakes in the world, like a dozen spoonfuls of salt a day. Before the widespread availability of refrigeration, they ate all sorts of salted, pickled, fermented foods, from soy sauce to salted fish. And in the areas that had twice the salt intake, they had twice the stroke mortality. But when the salt intake dropped, so did the stroke death rates, because when the salt came down, their blood pressures came down too. And high blood pressure is perhaps the single most important modifiable risk factor for stroke. So it's no big mystery why the westernization of the Japanese diet led to a drop in stroke risk. When they abandoned their more traditional diets, their obesity rates went up, their diabetes and coronary artery disease went up. But as they gave up the insanely high salt intake, their insanely high stroke rates correspondingly fell. It's like if you look at their stomach cancer rates, a cancer closely associated with excess salt intake. Their stomach rates came down beautifully as they westernized their diets away from salt-preserved foods. But of course, as they started eating more animal foods like dairy, their rates of fatal prostate cancer, for example, shot through the roof. Right? Compared to Japan, not only does the U.S. have 7 times more deaths from prostate cancer, but 5 times more deadly breast cancer, 3 times more colon cancer and lymphoma mortality, and 6 to 12 times the death rate from heart disease. Yes, Japanese stroke and stomach cancer rates were higher, but they were also eating up to 6 spoonfuls of salt a day. That would seem to be the most likely explanation, rather than some protective role of animal fat, as eventually acknowledged by the official Japanese guidelines for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. Now, one of the Harvard cohorts found a protective association between both saturated fat and trans fat for hemorrhagic strokes, prompting a sigh of relief throughout the cattle-producing Midwest, even though the researchers clearly concluded that, of course, we all have to cut down on animal fat and trans fat for the heart disease benefit regardless. But looking at another major Harvard cohort, they found no such protective association for any kind of stroke, and put all the studies together, and 0 protection across the board. Observational studies have found that higher LDL cholesterol seems to be associated with lower risk of hemorrhagic stroke, raising the possibility that cholesterol may be a double-edged sword, right? Decreasing the risk of ischemic stroke, but increasing the risk of hemorrhagic stroke. But low cholesterol levels in the aged may just be a surrogate for nutrient deficiencies, or a sign of debilitating diseases, or maybe they're on a combo of cholesterol-lowering drugs and blood thinners, and that's why we tend to see more brain bleeds in those with low cholesterol. You don't know until you put it to the test. Right? Put together about 24 randomized controlled trials, and the lower your cholesterol, the better when it comes to overall stroke risk, with no significant increases in the risk of hemorrhagic stroke risk, with lower achieved LDL cholesterol levels. The genetic data appears mixed, with some suggesting a lifetime of elevated LDL would give you a higher hemorrhagic stroke risk, and other data suggesting more of a double-edged sword effect. But any possible excess of bleeding stroke with lower cholesterol is greatly outweighed by the protective effect against the much more common clotting stroke, not to mention heart disease. Perhaps on the order of 18 fewer clotting strokes for every 1 extra bleeding stroke with cholesterol lowering. How about this as a candidate to explain the increased stroke risk among vegetarians? This is the type of stroke that appeared higher in vegetarians, but the cholesterol levels in vegans were even lower, and if anything, they had a trend towards a higher clotting stroke risk. So that doesn't really make sense. If there's some kind of protective factor in animal foods, it is to be hoped that a diet can be found that still protects against killer number 1, heart disease, without increasing the risk of killer number 5, stroke. But first we have to figure out what that factor is, a hunt that will continue next. In 2014, a study on dietary protein intake and stroke risk found that greater intake was associated with lower stroke risk, and furthermore, it was the animal protein that appeared to be particularly protective. Might that help explain why vegetarians were recently found to have a higher stroke rate than meat eaters? Animal protein consumption increases the level of a cancer-promoting growth hormone in the body, known as IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which can accelerate the progression of precancerous changes to invasive cancer. High blood concentrations are associated with increased risk of breast, prostate, colorectal, and lung cancers, potentially explaining the association between dairy milk and prostate cancer risk, for example. But there are also IGF-1 receptors on blood vessels, so maybe IGF-1 promotes cancer, but also brain artery integrity? People who have strokes appear to have lower blood levels of IGF-1, but it could just be a consequence of the stroke rather than the cause. There weren't any prospective studies over time until 2017, and indeed, higher IGF-1 levels were linked to lower risk of stroke. But is it cause and effect? In mice, the answer appears to be yes, and in a petri dish, IGF-1 appears to boost production of elastin, a stretchy protein that helps keep our arteries elastic. Higher levels are associated with less artery stiffness, but acromegaly patients like Andre the Giant, those with excessive levels of growth hormones like IGF-1, do not appear to have lower stroke rates, and a more recent study of dietary protein intake and risk of stroke, looking at a dozen studies of more than 500,000 people compared to only 7 studies with 250,000 in the previous analysis, found no association between dietary protein intake and the risk of stroke. In fact, if anything, dietary plant protein intake may actually decrease the risk of stroke. However, those with high blood pressure who have low IGF-1 levels do appear to be at increased risk of developing atherosclerosis, thickening of the artery walls leading up to the brain, but no such association was found in people with normal blood pressure. So there may be a cautionary lesson for vegans here. Yes, a whole food plant-based diet to downregulate IGF-1 activity may slow the human aging process, not to mention reduce the risk of some of the most common cancers that plague the Western world. But perhaps the take-home message should be that people who undertake to downregulate IGF-1 activity by cutting down on animal protein as a pro-longevity measure should take particular care to control their blood pressure, to preserve their cerebrovascular health, the health of the arteries in their brain. Right? In particular, they should keep salt intake relatively low, while ensuring an ample intake of potassium to keep their blood pressures down. So that means avoiding processed foods and avoiding adding salt, and in terms of potassium-rich foods, beans, sweet potatoes, and dark green leafy vegetables. So, might this explain the higher stroke risk found among vegetarians? No. Why? Because dairy and egg whites are animal proteins too. Only vegans have lower IGF-1 levels in both men and women. Right? So low IGF-1 levels can't explain why higher rates of stroke were found in vegetarians. Right? So what is it already? Right? I think the best explanation for the mystery is something called homocysteine, which I'll cover next. Leonardo da Vinci had a stroke. Might his vegetarian diet been to blame? His stroke may have been related to an increase in homocysteine level because of the long duration of his vegetarian diet. A suboptimal intake of vitamin B12, which is common in those eating plant-based diets unless they take a B12 supplement or eat B12-fortified foods regularly, can lead to an increased level of homocysteine in the blood, which is accepted as an important risk factor for stroke. Accepted may be overstating it. There's still controversy surrounding the connection between homocysteine and stroke risk, but those with higher homocysteine levels do seem to have more atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries that lead up to the brain compared to those with single-digit homocysteine levels, and do seem to be at higher risk of clotting strokes in observational studies, and more recently bleeding strokes, as well as increased risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, as well as all causes put together. Even more convincing is the genetic data. About 10% of the population has a gene that increases homocysteine levels about 2 points, and they do appear to have significantly higher odds of having a stroke. Most convincing would be randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials to prove homocysteine lowering with B vitamins can lower strokes, and that indeed appears to be the case for clotting strokes. Strokes with homocysteine-lowering interventions more than 5 times as likely to reduce stroke compared to placebo. Ironically, one of the arguments against the role of homocysteine in strokes is that, assuming that vegetarians have lower vitamin B12 levels, then the incidence of stroke should be increased among vegetarians, but supposedly this wasn't the case. But it had never been tested, never been studied until now, and vegetarians do appear to be at higher risk, and no wonder, as about a quarter of vegetarians and nearly 3/4 of the vegans studied were B12 depleted or deficient, resulting in extraordinarily high homocysteine levels. Why so much B12 deficiency? Because only a small minority were taking a dedicated B12 supplement. And unlike the US, B12 fortification of organic foods isn't allowed. So while US soy milk and other products may be fortified with B12, UK products may not. We don't see the same problem among US vegans in the Adventist study, presumed to be because of the B12 fortification of commonly eaten foods. It may be no coincidence that the only study I was able to find that showed a significantly lower stroke mortality risk among vegetarians was an Adventist study. But start eating strictly plant-based without B12 fortified foods or supplements, and B12 deficiency can develop, but that was only for those not eating sufficient foods fortified with B12. Those eating plant-based not being careful about getting a regular, reliable source of B12 have lower B12 levels and, consequently, higher homocysteine levels. The only way to prove vitamin B12 deficiency is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease in vegetarians is to put it to the test. And when researchers measured the amount of atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries, the main arteries supplying the brain, between vegetarians and non-vegetarians, no significant difference was found. They both look just as bad, even though vegetarians tend to have better risk factors, such as cholesterol and blood pressure. They suggest B12 deficiency is playing a role, but how do they know? Some measures of artery function weren't any better either. Again, they surmise vitamin B12 deficiency overwhelming the natural plant-based benefits. Yes, the beneficial effects of vegetarian diets on cholesterol and blood sugars need to be advocated, but the necessity to correct vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarian diets cannot be overstated. Sometimes vegetarians did even worse. Worse artery wall thickness, worse artery wall function, raising concern more than a decade before the new stroke study about the vascular health of vegetarians. Yes, their B12 was low. Yes, their homocysteine was high, suggesting that vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarians might have adverse effects on their vascular health. But what you would need is an interventional study, where you give them B12 and see if that fixes it. And here we go, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized crossover study, and the title gives it away. Vitamin B12 supplementation improves arterial function in vegetarians with subnormal vitamin B12 status. So that may explain it, right? Compromised vitamin B12 status among those eating more plant-based due to not taking B12 supplements or regularly eating vitamin B12 fortified foods may explain the higher stroke risk found among vegetarians. Unfortunately, many vegetarians resist taking vitamin B12 supplements due to misconceptions like holding on to the old myth that deficiency of this vitamin is rare among plant-based eaters. A common mistake is to think that the presence of dairy products and eggs in the diet, as in a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet, can still ensure proper intake of B12 despite excluding meat. And now that we may have nailed the cause, maybe future studies should focus on identifying ways of convincing vegetarians to routinely take vitamin B12 supplements in order to prevent a deficiency. 2 cases of young, strictly vegetarian individuals with no known vascular risk factors, yet suffering a stroke, or multiple strokes. Why? Most probably because they weren't taking vitamin B12 supplements, which leads to high homocysteine levels, which can attack your arteries. So those eating plant-based failing to supplement may increase one's risk of both heart disease and stroke. Now, vegetarians have so much heart disease risk factor benefit that they're still at lower risk overall, but this may help explain why vegetarians were found to have more stroke. Presumably this disparity would disappear with adequate B12 supplementation, and this benefit would grow even larger. Compared with non-vegetarians, vegetarians enjoy all these other advantages: better cholesterol, blood pressures, blood sugars, and obesity rates. But what about that stroke study? And even among studies that show benefits, they're not as pronounced as one might expect, which may be a result of that poor vitamin B12 status. Vitamin B12 deficiency may negate some of the cardiovascular disease prevention benefits of vegetarian diet. So in order to further reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, vegetarians should be advised to use B12 supplements. How can you determine your B12 status? By the time you're symptomatic with B12 deficiency, it's too late, and initially the symptoms can be so subtle that you might even miss them. And well before you develop clinical deficiency, you develop metabolic vitamin B12 deficiency, a missed opportunity to prevent strokes, where you have enough B12 to avoid deficiency symptoms, but not enough to keep your homocysteine in check. Underdiagnosis of the condition results largely from failure to understand that a normal B12 blood level may not reflect adequate functional B12 status. The levels of B12 in your blood does not always represent the level of B12 in your cells. You can have a severe functional deficiency of B12 even though your blood levels are normal or even high. Most physicians tend to assume that if the B12 level in your blood is normal, then there's no problem. But within the lower range of normal, 30% of patients could have metabolic B12 deficiency with high homocysteine levels. Measuring methylmalonic acid levels, or homocysteine directly, are more accurate reflection of vitamin B12 functional status. Methylmalonic acid can be a simple urine test. You're looking for less than a value of 4 micrograms per milligram of creatinine. Elevated MMA is a specific marker of vitamin B12 deficiency, while homocysteine rises in the context of both vitamin B12 and folate deficiencies. And so metabolic B12 deficiency is defined by an elevation in MMA levels, or by an elevation of homocysteine in people getting enough folate, even without eating beans and greens, which are packed with folate. Folic acid is added to the flour supply by law, and so high homocysteine levels these days may be mostly a B12 problem. Ideally, you're looking for a homocysteine level in your blood down in the single digits. Measured this way, the prevalence of functional B12 deficiency is dramatically higher than previously assumed, like 10 to 40% of the general population, and more than 40% in vegetarians, and the majority of vegans who aren't scrupulous about getting their B12. Some suggest that those on plant-based diets check their vitamin B12 status every year, but you shouldn't need to if you're adequately supplementing. And evidently there are rare cases of vitamin B12 deficiency that can't be picked up on any test, so you better just make sure you're getting enough. Now, if you do get your homocysteine tested, and it's still up in the double digits, even despite B12 supplementation, I do have a suggestion in the final videos of this series, which we'll turn to next. Almost universally, research findings show a poor vitamin B12 status among vegetarians because they're not taking vitamin B12 supplements like they should. And this results in an elevation of homocysteine levels that may explain why vegetarians were recently found to have higher rates of stroke. Of course, plant-based eating is just one of many ways to get B12 deficient. I mean, even laughing gas can do it. In as short as 2 days, thanks to the recreational use of whipped cream canister gas. That's something new I learned today. Anyways, if you do eat plant-based, giving vegetarians and vegans even as little as 50 micrograms once a day of cyanocobalamin, the recommended most stable form of vitamin B12 supplement, and their homocysteine levels start up in the elevated zone, and within 1 to 2 months, their homocysteines normalize right down into the safe zone under 10. Or just 2,000 micrograms of cyanocobalamin once a week, and you get the same beautiful result. But not always. In this study, even 500 micrograms a day, either as a sublingual chewable or swallowable regular B12 supplement, didn't normalize homocysteine within a month. Now, presumably if they had kept it up, their levels would have continued to fall, like in the other study. But if you're plant-based, have been taking your B12 and your homocysteine levels are still too high, meaning above 10, is there anything else you can do? Now, inadequate folate intake can also increase homocysteine, but folate comes from the same root as foliage. It's found in leaves, concentrated in greens as well as beans. But if you're eating beans and greens, taking your B12 and your homocysteine level is still too high, then I'd suggest trying as an experiment, taking 1 gram of creatine a day and getting your homocysteine levels retested in a month to see if it helped. Creatine is a compound formed naturally in the human body that is primarily involved in energy production in our muscles and brain. It's also naturally formed in the bodies of many animals we eat, and so when we eat their muscles, we also can take in some creatine through our diet. We need about 2 grams a day, so those who eat meat may get like 1 gram from their diet, and their body makes the rest from scratch. There are rare birth defects where you're born without the ability to make it, in which case you have to get it from your diet, but otherwise, our bodies make as much as we need to maintain normal concentrations in our muscles. When you cut out meat, the amount of creatine floating around your bloodstream goes down, but the amount in your brain remains the same, showing dietary creatine doesn't influence the levels of brain creatine, because your brain just makes all the creatine you need. The level in vegetarian muscles is lower, but that doesn't seem to affect performance, as both vegetarians and meat eaters respond to creatine supplementation with similar increases in muscle power output. And if vegetarian muscle creatine was insufficient, then presumably they would have seen an even bigger boost. Right? So basically, all that happens when you eat meat is that your body just doesn't have to make as much. What does this all have to do with homocysteine? OK, in the process of making creatine, your body produces homocysteine as a waste product. Now, normally this isn't a problem, because your body has 2 ways to detoxify it, using vitamin B6, or using a combination of vitamins B12 and folate. Now, B6 is found in both plant and animal foods. It's rare to be deficient, but B12 is mainly in animal foods, and so it can be too low in those eating plant-based who don't supplement or eat B12-fortified foods, and folate is concentrated in plant foods, so it can be low in those who don't regularly eat greens or beans or folic acid-fortified grains. And without that escape valve, homocysteine levels can get too high. If, however, you're eating a healthy plant-based diet and taking your B12 supplement, your homocysteine levels should be fine, but what if they're not? Right? One might predict that if you started taking creatine supplements, the level of homocysteine might go down, since you're not going to have to be making so much of it from scratch, producing homocysteine as a byproduct. But you don't know until you put it to the test, which we'll cover next. The average blood levels of homocysteine in men is about 1.5 points higher than in women. Maybe that's one of the reasons why men tend to be at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Women don't need to make as much creatine as men, since they tend to have less muscle mass, and that may help explain the gender gap in homocysteine levels. If you remember from my last video, in the process of making creatine, your body produces homocysteine as a byproduct. So maybe for people with stubbornly high homocysteine levels that don't sufficiently respond to B vitamins, perhaps creatine supplementation may represent a practical strategy to draw homocysteine levels down into the normal range. It seemed to work in rats, but in humans it worked in one study, this one, but didn't seem to work in another study, this one, or this one. And in this study, homocysteine levels were even driven up. So this whole suggestion that taking creatine supplements would lower homocysteine was called into question. But all those studies were done in non-vegetarians, so they were effectively already supplementing with creatine every day in the form of muscle meat. So they were basically just testing higher versus lower supplementation. Those eating strictly plant-based make all their creatine from scratch, so they be more sensitive to an added creatine source. But there were never any studies on creatine supplementation in vegans for homocysteine lowering, until now. They took a bunch of vegans who were not supplementing their diets with vitamin B12, so some of their homocysteine levels were like through the roof, a few as high as 50, when the ideal is more like under 10. But after taking some creatine for a few weeks, all of their homocysteine levels normalized, before and after. Now, they didn't really normalize, which would have been under 10, but that's presumably because they weren't taking any B12. Give vegetarians and vegans vitamin B12 supplements, either daily dosing or once a week, and their levels really normalize in a matter of months. But the fact that even without B12, that you could bring down homocysteine levels with creatine alone suggests, to me at least, that if your homocysteine is elevated on a plant-based diet, meaning above 10, despite taking B12 supplements and eating greens and beans to get enough folate, well, then it may be worth experimenting with supplementing with a gram of creatine for a few weeks and see if your homocysteine levels come down. Why 1 gram? That's approximately how much non-vegetarians are not having to make themselves. That's how much erased vegetarian discrepancies in blood and muscle, and how much has been shown to be safe in the longer term. How safe exactly is it? Well, one can take a bit of comfort in the fact that it's one of the world's best-selling dietary supplements, with literally billions of servings taken, and the only consistently reported side effect has been weight gain, presumed to be from water retention. The only serious side effects appear to be among those with pre-existing kidney diseases, taking whopping doses of 20 grams a day. A concern was raised that creatine could potentially form a carcinogen known as N-nitrososarcosine when it hit the acid bath of the stomach, but when actually put to the test, this does not appear to be a problem. Bottom line, doses up to 3 grams a day are unlikely to pose any risk, provided high-purity creatine is used. And as we all know, dietary supplements are not regulated by the FDA, may contain contaminants, or not actually contain what's on the label. Contaminants generated during the industrial production. When researchers looked at 33 samples of creatine supplements made in the US and Europe, they all did actually contain creatine, which is nice, but about half exceeded the maximum level recommended by food safety authorities for at least one contaminant. The researchers recommend that consumers give their preference to products obtained by producers that ensure the highest quality control. Easier said than done. Because of the potential risks, I don't think people should be taking creatine supplements willy-nilly, but the potential benefits may exceed the potential risks if, again, you're on a healthy plant-based diet, taking B12, and your homocysteine levels are still not under 10. I would suggest giving a gram a day of creatine a try to see if it brings it down. The reason I did this whole video series all goes back to this study, which found that although the overall cardiovascular disease risk is lower in vegetarians and vegans combined, they appeared to be at slightly higher stroke risk. I went through a list of potential causes, arrived at elevated homocysteine, and the solution, a regular, reliable source of vitamin B12. The cheapest, easiest method that I personally use is one 2,500 microgram chewable tablet of cyanocobalamin. In fact, you can just use 2,000 microgram once a week, and cyanocobalamin is the most stable source of B12. Take that once a week, and then, as I detailed in this video, a backup plan for those doing that and still having elevated homocysteine is an empirical trial of 1 gram a day of creatine supplementation, which has been shown to improve at least capillary blood flow in those who started out with high homocysteine levels. The bottom line is that plant-based diets appear to markedly reduce our risk of multiple leading killer diseases, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and many common types of cancer, but an increased risk of stroke may represent an Achilles heel. Nonetheless, they have the potential to achieve a truly exceptional health span if they face this problem forthrightly by restricting salt intake and taking other practical measures that promote brain artery health. Nonetheless, these considerations do not justify nutritional nihilism. On balance, even strictly plant-based diets offer such versatile protection to long-term health that they remain highly recommendable. Most likely, the optimum strategy is to eat plant-based, along with going out of the way to eat particularly protective foods, as I talked about before, regular aerobic exercise, and most importantly, taking your vitamin B12. Oh, and try not to huff whipped cream charging canister gas.